Hello, global gardeners. What time is it? It's gardening time. So nice to have you here today, getting the community together and finishing out 2024 with my last live stream of this year. There'll be many more to come. And a review of some of what I've done in my garden this year. I hope to see some of what you've done in your garden this year and how that's going to work to our benefit as we plan 2025. So great to see everybody here. Let's start with a comment from Sherry. I'm going through my pantry of dried beans and dehydrated and preserved fruits and veggies and deciding what makes sense for me to grow. I love that. And that's the basic theme of the show today. Looking back, figuring out, thinking, planning. What is it that makes sense for you to grow in your garden? And this is a great suggestion from Sherry. Go through your pantry. What is it that you are eating in your normal diet? What is it you are preserving as part of your gardening journey? And use that as a way to try to figure out what it is you want to grow in the future. So often we grow plants that are fun to grow, but we may not really see the benefit from them. I don't grow lima beans because I just don't like lima beans. So it doesn't make sense for me to grow lima beans, except this year I did grow lima beans as part of my 15 bean soup recipe. Lima beans are part of that. I planted all those beans and I had some lima beans as a result of it. Lima beans mixed together in a soup are okay. That makes some sense. But as I look into my pantry, deciding what I want to grow for the future, there are definitely some plants that don't make the list and other plants that make the list every year. So, how do you look to the selection of your seeds, of your plants for what you're going to put in your garden beds? And Sherry, thanks for that idea. Looking in the pantry is a great way to try to figure it out. Bowtie Life in the Garden, good morning to you, fellow gardeners from around the galaxy. That's often. I did want to mention over the course of the show today, so I'm looking for your suggestions as well. Many of you have channels and you produce videos, and if you have another channel that you like that may not be part of our normal discussion, go ahead and put it in the comments. I'm always trying to encourage you to view other channels, to see other shows. And Bowtie Life in the Garden had a recent video with the Grinch in the garden. So that may be something fun to check out, along with all of your other favorites. And I hope you'll share some of those with us. Scott Joe, good morning to you. I'm actually trying to map out what I will grow and in what boxes. This past year, I made a few more garden boxes and metal raised beds. Awesome. Expanding the garden is one of my favorite things to do. And then trying to figure out what to put in those beds can be a challenge. So when I look at my year-end review in the garden, I look back to this year first, because hopefully it's the one that's freshest in my memory, and try to figure out what I liked about this year and if it's something I want to repeat for next year. And then beyond that, I'll look to last year and the previous year and the previous year. I'll look at my garden journals. I'll look at my YouTube videos to try to see what I have enjoyed and what has done well. And that really helps me figure out what I'm going to do, particularly in the new beds, because that can be a challenge, Scott. I totally get it. This year, I added a number of new beds. And as I put the beds in place, I had to figure out what to do with those new beds as well. I wanted to grow more strawberries. One of my new beds was devoted to new strawberries. And luckily, I discovered the Tri-Star variety. I absolutely love it. It's in one of those new beds, and it will continue to be in that bed because I like it so much. I had another one of my beds, my Garden in Minutes metal bed. didn't really know what to do with it, particularly using the grid watering system, which I love from Garden in Minutes. And so it made sense as I was thinking about doing a video with the 15 bean soup beans as seeds to use that grid system and to use that bed to grow 15 different types of beans. I built a whole other bed and never figured out what I wanted to put in it. So it was empty all summer long and going into the fall. And now, as I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next year, it can be a challenge to try to figure out what you're going to do in your expanded beds. So, what am I thinking as a possibility as I look back? One of my greatest successes this year, I was so pleased with it on so many levels, was my paprika experiment, growing those different varieties of Hungarian peppers. And I devoted most of a bed to those peppers. The other part of the bed was a full bed of nothing but peppers, but half the bed was some spicy peppers, and the other half of the bed were the Hungarian peppers, because I really didn't know how well they were going to do, and I didn't know how well it was going to turn out. They did great. So now that I have an extra bed and I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it, at the top of the list is peppers, growing more peppers, more of the varieties that I know will do well, but maybe now trying some new varieties. The new 6 Hungarian pepper varieties that did so well just really stoked an interest in me to try new varieties that I need to discover and figure out purposes for those peppers. So right now I have fermented peppers in jars in my refrigerator. I've got powdered pepper for my paprika. I've got frozen peppers. I've got freeze-dried peppers because I grew a lot of peppers this year, and it just doesn't seem like enough. So my review this year says, I love growing these peppers. And I know some of you that are watching now and watching on replay grow a ton of peppers. And so I've got some garden buddies on YouTube that are growing hundreds of varieties of peppers. I think that may be one of those arenas to venture into next year because I liked it so much this year. And there's Jay. Thank you, Jay. We've got both Jay and Heidi with us today. Such fantastic helpers on this channel. And there's the link to that video on how to make paprika. And I showed that whole process from harvesting the peppers to putting it into jars. And it was so successful. And a lot of my family is getting paprika for Christmas because I just got so much. It was so successful. I didn't expect it to be so good. And it is. And now I can share it with others. So that's one of those things when we look back in the garden, look more than just the plant and how well the plant did, but you can look beyond that to what did the plant give you and what can it give others. So my Hungarian pepper plants, I loved growing. They did great, gave me great satisfaction. I've already let some of my family members taste some of these pepper powders, blew their socks off. So why not give it as gifts? Then they feel better, I feel better, and it's a use for the powder that I can replicate next year. I love those kind of things when you can really improve your own well-being by growing plants. Gardening is so good for that. But you could really spread that positive well-being with friends and family. So think about that as you look back on the year and try to figure out what was most successful in your garden and what is it that you might want to try again. So shout out to Tony from Simplified Gardening asking, plenty of snow there. Actually, no, I'll talk about this background. This is not my garden background today. I actually don't have much snow. The thing about the snow here in my part of Colorado is we will occasionally get a lot of snow, and this year has been snowier than most. We have almost 2 feet of snow above our normal snow levels. So November and December really aren't our snowiest months for me in Colorado. Typically, we'll get about 6 inches of snow between both November and December put together. This year, we've got more than 26 inches of snow so far. So who knows what's going to happen. But because of this roller coaster weather I have, we've had days that the temperatures are getting into the 60s. We had a couple 60-degree days recently, about 16 degrees Celsius, and almost all of the snow is gone. At night, however, every night is below freezing, well below freezing. Last night, it got down to a little bit above 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's what I saw on the thermometer when I got up. So that's about -7 Celsius. And then it warms right up because it's sunny. The ground is frozen, but the air is nice and warm. And when the sun hits the snow, it melts. So the only snow I have is in those areas where it's shaded, and it stays shaded throughout the winter, and the sun never hits that snow. So I've got pockets of snow that are maybe an inch or two deep, but for the most part, no, my garden is completely clear of snow, and this week looks pretty clear. And so far, next week looks pretty clear as far as snow. So no snow in the forecast. And I'm okay with that. I've actually been able to get out and get some good stuff done in the garden. My garden's cleaned up, and I've put some things in place. So I'm going to be building a fence around some of my primary vegetable garden beds, and I've already put all of those posts in place. I'm going to build a little retaining wall in the far back by my fruit trees. I've already put some of those concrete blocks in place. So this is the time of year where I get ready for what I'm going to do next year. And December is typically a month I can do a lot outside because there's not a lot of snow. The days are sunny, and it's definitely the kind of weather I can work in. And so why am I doing some of these projects? Why am I getting ready for things like building of fences? Because as I look back to this year in my garden, and I got my new puppy Lika, and Mala and Lika run and play and wrestle and chase each other. Often that takes them through my garden beds. The kind of problem I don't have with Mala by herself, she never really ran through the beds or did too much damage to the plants. But now, particularly with a puppy, there's a lot more damage to my plants and my garden. So I'm going to have to put a bed in place. Might as well do some of that preparatory work when you can't grow plants, when it's cold outside. And I'm actually getting a lot done along those lines. So I think that's one of those kind of things that as you look back to what happened in your garden and what you're going to do next year, this is a good time of year to start some of that planning and maybe some of that prep work. Rachel says, I also grow jalapenos to pickle for my neighbor. They eat them by the jar. That's awesome. So I'll offer this suggestion to you, Rachel, because this is one of those things that when I say to benefit those around you and to benefit your family in particular, this is a perfect example to grow something, to make something, to give to someone else. And I did that for a number of years with, and still do, with members of my family. But my brother-in-law in particular really liked the pickled peppers so much that he started doing it himself. So I actually don't give him pickled peppers anymore because he pickles his own peppers primarily through fermentation. And he just loves doing his peppers and eats them by the jar. So if you have a friend like that you can share your pickled peppers with, show them how to make pickled peppers, and they may end up doing it on their own and absolutely love it. That's the way he is with me. So I think that's one of those gifts that you can give, is to actually share some of your knowledge and your experience, and someone else can take that and start doing something that they love. I would give a jar of pickled peppers typically, And now he makes a jar sometimes weekly, sometimes numerous jars in the same week. So he can definitely make himself happier than I ever could because he now knows how to do it. And I love that ability to share some of that knowledge. Lisa's asking a question. How often do you water your plants in the greenhouse? I have my strawberries in a green stock, and I'm not sure how often to water. So good question. I just watered yesterday. And before that, I think it was 3 days prior. And so I've got strawberries in my green stock in the greenhouse. And I go out and like I do often throughout my garden, I stick my finger in the soil to see how moist it is. And I kind of use that as a gauge for determining when to water. My greenhouse gets very hot during the day, even though it's cold at night and it does cool down at night. The water is keeping it above freezing on most days. And I'm having to ventilate my greenhouse because on the sunny Colorado days here, when it gets to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 Celsius, or even when it gets up to 60, like we were talking about earlier at 16 Celsius, it can get very hot in my greenhouse if I don't ventilate it. So between that heat and between the air blowing through when I open the doors, it dries out quite a bit. And even though I've got mulch on my beds, the green stock being elevated tends to dry out even faster. So about every 3 days, I'm going out and with my watering can, because everything is frozen in the hose, I am watering the plants. And that seems to be working pretty well. I've been enjoying strawberries. I don't think I've harvested this week, but I had some strawberries last week in the greenhouse, which is just amazing. And I noticed yesterday when I was out there that my fig trees, my Chicago fig trees, last year it was colder. My greenhouse was already colder by this time, and the fig trees had gone dormant. The young growth last year was their first real year of growth, all died back to the ground. Right now in my greenhouse, my Chicago fig trees are actually budding. They're actually showing new growth almost at the end of December now. So I'm watering them as well. And it's also on about a 3-day cycle. So with plants growing, I'm watering more often. Last year, I didn't have all those plants growing, and I would just go out to try to keep the soil moist around those figs maybe once a week, sometimes a little longer. But this year, because things are actively growing, it's definitely more often that I'm getting out there and doing some of those things. John C. says, I realized I need more fruit in my garden. So I've planted 6 columnar fruit trees, 2 apples, 2 plums, a cherry, and a pear. Awesome. I love that idea. And that's exactly what I'm talking about is what do you need more of and do it. And so the columnar trees are great. Look at Eli and Kate's channel. They've got some good videos on their columnar apple trees that are growing just outside the door of their greenhouse. And particularly the pruning videos of their columnar apple trees, gold. I don't think I've seen another video on YouTube that shows how to prune the columnar apples. And you can see it on Eli and Kate's channel. And so I lost some of my columnar apple trees. So I started the year with 2. I added 2. And between the weather and the dogs, I'm down to 1. So I also need new columnar apple trees, but I'm waiting until I build my new garden section to put them in. And I think that'll help their survival a little bit. I tried something new. And so this is one of those review items. When we look back on the year, it's easy to look at the successes, like I was talking about with my Hungarian peppers. It's easy to look at those things that do well and to want to repeat those. But it's also important to look at the things that didn't work, to look at the failures, and then to try to learn from them moving into future gardening years. And my columnar apple trees taught me some lessons. So I had this vision of this secret garden that I talked about recently, and I want some plants growing in there to make it just a really inviting space. It's going to be fenced. It's going to be a sitting area. There's going to be a water feature. And I wanted some columnar apple trees in the background against my greenhouse. And I chose the columnar apple trees because I didn't want to put a full-size fruit tree that would shade my greenhouse. I wanted the greenhouse to be the backdrop with some fruit trees in front of it and then a water feature. You'll see all of this when it gets built out, and I show my videos, of course. And so I planted my columnar apple trees in front of my greenhouse, 3 feet away from the greenhouse, which is more than enough space for those columnar apple trees. They just grow in a slender growth pattern. They don't spread out. And it would have been a great idea, except for my sunny, hot days here in Colorado. And what I didn't anticipate was the reflective heat from the greenhouse. The sun shining on that polycarbonate and heating the soil directly in front of it, and frying the leaves of these young apple trees that were growing in front of it. If the trees had been bigger, it probably wouldn't have been an issue, but I put in bare root trees, still very small, just young whips, and they got fried, literally fried. The leaves turned brown and crisp, and the tree died. And the only one that survived was the one that I'd actually put in the ground the previous year, and it was bigger and it wasn't as affected by the crazy heat that we had this year. So moving forward, that's a lesson for me to analyze and try to figure out what I'm going to do. I still want to grow columnar apple trees, but that's not the spot to grow them. So I'll probably stick with apples, but I like the idea, John, of doing the plums and the cherry and the pear as well. So good for you. Always a great idea to figure out what those new things are going to be, and definitely to spread out and to try some new things. Our Hen House 3, good to see you here today. Here's a question. I'm going to do some experiment planting with dried bean varieties. How far apart should I grow them from each other? So if you look at the video that I did recently, the one on the 15 bean soup, you'll see that I was putting 9 seeds basically in every square foot. It actually ends up being a square 10 inches because the grid I used was a little bit smaller. But basically, I grew 9 bush bean plants per square foot. They supported each other. I didn't need any other support. They did great, had a harvest, had multiple harvests. And that's kind of a general guideline. 3 inches apart is really all bean plants will need if the soil is good and if you give them the full sun and everything they need and keep them watered. If it's a vining variety, then you'll need to account for the trellis, for whatever the beans are going to grow up. And 3 to 6 inches is generally a good spacing for bean seeds. Bush beans, more toward the 6 inches if it's a really bushy bean plant. Because I really didn't know what to expect from my plants, I did put them a little bit closer together, and they were all the bush varieties, but they just grew into each other and did fine. They might have done better if I gave them a little bit more space, but I was experimenting too. So as part of an experiment with your beans, put some of them 3 inches apart, put some of them 6 inches apart, and then at the end of the season, see which did better, so that next year, when you do your year-end review, you can figure out what is the ideal solution for you based on your soil and your weather and your sun and all the other patterns in your garden. That will really help give you the definitive answer. But I would start 3 to 6 inches apart as a guideline if you're experimenting with new bean varieties. And if you know whether they're a bush bean or a pole bean, then that can also affect the spacing, whether you choose to go a little bit closer together or a little bit farther apart. Outlier Gardener, good morning. My goal for 2025 is to not buy any more seeds and to plant the varieties in my stash that I didn't get around to in 2024. My eyes are always bigger than my garden space. I am with you. Totally. In fact, I've mentioned this in recent shows as well. That's one of my goals going into next year as well. This last year, I bought everything that I put in my garden as an experiment, trying new varieties that some of you had suggested. This year, I've got so many seed packets from what I bought this year and what I bought last year and what I bought the year before. And it is time to try to save some money and use the bean seeds and the pea seeds and the tomato seeds and the pepper seeds, all the seeds that I already have. So I am with you. I think that is a great goal, and I'm planning on making some videos about that, talking about how to save money in the garden by not spending more money in the garden. Use what you already have, and many of those are probably some of your favorites. So you're going to grow them again anyway. Might as well use the seed you already have rather than buying new stuff. Big Will Dog, good to see you. Now I'm trying to figure out where in my house I want to record my opening and closing segments of my videos. Since my garage is cold and unheated, do your dogs get in the way at times? So not really. If you look at my videos, pretty much every video I have in the last couple of years, you can see my dogs at some point. They may be in the background lying down. They may be walking through in the background, but no, they don't. As energetic as they are running around when they play, once I settle down, they tend to settle down. Once I set my camera up and start talking, they're usually pretty good. Now, occasionally, one or both of them will come up while I'm talking, sitting on my garden bed. And occasionally I'll keep that shot in a video if it all works out, but it's not a big deal to reshoot generally. And so this is one of those behind the scenes for YouTubers. I generally, on average, shoot every single one of my shots 2 to 3 times. Because I didn't say it the way I wanted to say it, because I wanted a different angle, because I decided that I needed to say more or I needed to say less. And so if I can do a shot in less than 3 attempts, it's a golden day. And so don't think that it has to be perfect every single time. If your dogs get in the way, your dogs get in the way. And so you just reshoot the shot, or you use them in the shot. I had a video when I was kneeling next to my asparagus bed. I think this video is about 2 years old, and I was talking about the pests in your garden and animals. Pets are a pest if they walk through the bed, as I've already talked about, or dig in the bed or run through the bed. And so Mala happened to be standing nearby as I'm talking about this. And I kind of gave the hand signal that I give to call her, and she walked across the bed. It was perfect. It was exactly what I wanted for the shot. And so I used it in that particular video. So don't always think of your pets or your dogs getting in the way. Sometimes try to incorporate them into the shot. And there's been other times where they've been sitting there nicely and I'll pet them and talk to the camera while I'm petting the dogs. So they're part of my garden. So they might as well be part of my videos as well. And just accept that, yes, sometimes they do get in the way and sometimes you need to reshoot the shot. I always review my shots after I take them as well, because you never know what your dogs are doing in the background, and you may need to shoot the shot again. I haven't had big issues with that, but occasionally they're going to be digging or chasing or doing something in the background that you might not want in the shot, and you'll have to reshoot it. And sometimes I've had to move the camera because the dogs aren't moving because they're playing in the background. It's all part of making videos and all part of having dogs, but have fun with it. Have fun with it and see if you can incorporate some of it and it may work to your benefit. Oh, and saying we're looking at 0 chill hours this season. I'm worried about poor fruit set. Wow. So obviously you're having a warmer year than normal. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing on the fruit set concerns. So when we talk about chill hours, there are many fruits, particularly apples. Apples are one of those things that's a perfect example because apples grow here in the United States in northern states like Washington. They don't grow in southern states like Florida because the apples need chill hours. They need a certain amount of time. The dormant tree needs to be exposed to cold temperatures for a set number of hours for the fruit to develop in the following year. Now, surprisingly, it doesn't have to be below freezing. So most of the chill hours that fruit trees in particular need is below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's about 4.5 degrees Celsius. So for instance, I have a pomegranate tree. Pomegranates do need chill hours, but if they get too cold, they'll die. They can't handle temperatures well below freezing, but they need cool temperatures. So I have my pomegranate tree in a big pot, and I kept my pot outside for the weeks that were leading into my winter, and the nights were getting down to freezing, and then they were starting to get down below freezing, and then they got above freezing. But I had a good period of time that the nighttime temperature was below that 40-degree threshold. It was above the 20-degree point, -7 Celsius, which is when serious damage can take place. And then once the temperatures did start dropping down to that critical threshold, I brought the pots indoors. So you might not be getting the cold freezing temperatures, but if you're getting sustained time below that 40 degrees, then you're probably going to be okay. And there's still lots of time left. It's surprising how little the hours are. So it's all relative, but some fruit trees might only need 200 chill hours. Well, if you think about a cold night that might have 8 hours below that 40-degree threshold, and you only need 200 hours, you're basically looking at 4 weeks. So as long as you have 4 weeks over the course of the winter where the nighttime temperatures are going to be that cold, you're probably going to be okay. And of course, it does depend on the fruit tree, and it depends on how many chill hours that those trees need. But I wouldn't worry too much about it. Who knows what January and February is going to bring us? And I'm sure many of you are already having to deal with some winter issues that are unusual for December, like extra snow or extra cold. So have some patience and just realize that it'll probably be okay going into January and February because it's cumulative. It doesn't need to be 25 days in a row. It can be 25 days over the course of the winter that exposes those plants to those cold temperatures to get those chill hours built up. So you can keep track of it. I've never actually done that because my winters are always so cold. But I do know there are some regions where they do track the chill hours to see how big of a concern it is. And if that's your situation, then definitely keep tracking and see if maybe you'll be able to not be so concerned about it. Eli and Kate says, I love bush beans, one of my favorite things to grow. And I'm so glad you say that because your bush beans look great in your garden. And that's another thing about choosing the plants that you're going to grow is the ones that do well and the ones that look good in your garden. And of course, the ones that you're going to be able to harvest and enjoy. Scott's asking, I had some bush beans that ended up growing like a vine. Has anyone seen that? So it depends on the bush bean, but yeah, I've had bush beans that ended up growing more like a vine. I don't know if it was a genetic mutation like we were talking about last week, or if it was just a variety that had more of a tall stature. It's not, I wouldn't say it's normal for a bush bean that is generally smaller and bushier to do that, but it happens. That's all part of gardening, especially if there is some type of genetic change that's going on within that plant. And so if it's a bean you like, and if you like that vining structure, even though it's supposed to be a bush bean, save some of those beans and plant them again for next year. That's all part of enjoying some of the things that are happening in your garden and using it to your benefit if you can get away with it. Darth X says, I didn't get any beans this year. The slugs ate the seedlings. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, so use that to your benefit. You know, so many people have slug issues. You know, I don't, luckily, because I live in a very dry, very cold, very windy region for much of the year. And so the slugs just don't do well. I've had slugs in my garden before, but not as a great pest. And generally, just the few that live underneath the mulch and they'll crawl out and nibble on my strawberries. That's the worst problem I've had. So what do? I grow my strawberries in raised beds, tall raised beds, to reduce the likelihood that the slugs are going to find my strawberries. And so it's the same kind of thing with your beans. Maybe grow in a tall raised bed so that the slugs are less likely to find your beans. Or use some of those other methods to deal with the slugs, like traps. Wet cardboard is an ideal trap. Just wet a sheet of cardboard and lay it next to the bed you got your beans growing in, and come out the next morning and you'll probably find a lot of slugs underneath that wet cardboard. Then you can deal with the slugs. Feed them to your ducks or throw them in your compost pile or whatever you want to do with the slugs. But trapping them can be very effective for dealing with a pest like that. And then maybe growing differently and putting barriers up to try to keep the slugs out. So I'm sorry you didn't get any slugs this year, but use the knowledge that you gained from that to get some slug control next year and to have beans next year. And then you can report back to us and let us know how successful your plants were because you used this winter time for the planting and for the preparation. And as I'm waiting for the warm weather to return someday, I'm doing a lot of planning. I'm doing a lot of prep to deal with some of those concerns. Slugs for you, dogs for me, whatever the pest is that you've got to deal with it in December and January, in winter, for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, before you get the plants in the ground where they could be a problem into the future. Eli and Kate says, pets generally aren't an issue when filming. It's usually the wife wandering about, not paying attention. That's funny. So I think most of us enjoy seeing Kate in the background when she doesn't know she's on film. So that's funny. I haven't had that issue with anyone except for my neighbors, because I usually plan for, if there's, you know, a family member in the house, I usually plan for it and they know I'm out filming. But like I said, where you have to reshoot your shots, there's been a number of times that I've had a perfect take, said everything I wanted to say, showed everything I wanted to show, and then I watched the replay and my neighbor is walking along the fence behind me and it just becomes so distracting. I got to wait till the neighbor disappears to reshoot the shot. Or especially when I'm shooting in my greenhouse, the neighbor will often come out for a conversation. So I'll actually be standing at the camera and she wants to have a conversation. It's not a big problem. I love talking with my neighbor and she likes talking with me. We're on very good terms, which is nice when you have neighbors to have. And if I can just go ahead and delay my filming for a few minutes to talk to her, it's no problem. But yes, there are often those kind of things that you have to deal with when you're filming. DJ says, Gardner Scott, your puppy's adorable and a bit of a wild child. She absolutely is. she and Mala seem to play well together. They do. They play very well together. And Mala is the big sister. So every time Mala wants to go outside, Lika wants to go outside. Now, there are a lot of times Lika loves being outside. Mala loves being outside. This morning, we got up early. I let them out. I went back to bed. Lika went back to bed. And Mala stayed out in the cold for about another hour. Mala loves staying out in the cold. Lika loves staying outside during the middle of the day. And so she'll be out for an hour or two during the day when it's me and Mala inside resting. So they wear themselves out to the point that there's a lot of rest time, but it's also a lot of playtime. So they do very well together, and I'm glad that you acknowledge that, because it's fun. Making the decision to get a second dog can be a challenge, and you're not sure if it's the right decision. But in my case, the two dogs together are really doing well, and I'm glad that they're doing well together, which is important. So Myra's asking, after a strawberry puts on color, is that when it stops growing? When to harvest? And so the strawberry fruit, when it reaches the size it's going to grow to, then it changes color. There might be some additional growth, but for the most part, it's not going to grow anymore after it reaches its full color, red. And so you want to harvest when it's fully red. I love eating my fresh strawberries, and that's the best way to tell, particularly if you've got a lot of strawberries that are showing up at the same time. Eat one. And if it's red and ripe and ready to go, then you can harvest a lot of the others. Sometimes I'll harvest one and it's not as sweet as it should be. That tells me it was probably just a day early. And so I'll wait a day for all the others. But that's when to harvest. The nice thing about strawberries is the color will tell you when they're ready to harvest. Tomatoes anymore are not that case, because there are so many different colors of tomatoes. Peppers will continue to grow and change color. And so you just kind of wait for whatever color it is with the pepper. They can be harvested at any time. But the strawberries, to get the best flavor, you want to get them at their deepest, richest color, and then enjoy them. So that's the time to harvest, and that's when they're going to stop growing. The plants will continue growing as long as they have the conditions. So even in my greenhouse right now, in my green stock, I have new growth on my strawberry plants. Some of the plants that it got excessively hot a few weeks back and fried the leaves, and then had a couple days where it got really, really cold, and some of the plants started going dormant. Now the conditions are ideal for them this last week in particular, and I've got new growth on my strawberry plants, even though it's at or just above freezing in my greenhouse. The strawberry plants are still growing, so they're very durable plants. And so it's just deciding when you want to harvest the fruit, and generally it's the color that you're looking for that's going to make that determination. You can harvest them earlier, but you're going to get the best flavor when they're at full color. And I love that. I have noticed a difference in my strawberries. So the strawberries that are growing at this time of year, there's less light, so it's taking them a little bit longer to ripen. And the temperature is colder than generally they're exposed to outdoors during the middle of summer when I'm doing most of my harvesting. So the strawberry tends to be a little bit denser. It's not as light and juicy, still flavorful, but I have noticed a difference in this time of year. I've never harvested strawberries in December before, because I've never had strawberries in a greenhouse, but it's interesting to note the difference in the different times of year that they grow. Serena is saying, our meteorologist mentioned a polar vortex that will be moving down through the Midwest, January 15th to the end of February. What protective measures should we take to protect apple trees, etc.? So generally, if you've chosen the right variety of tree, they're going to be fine. And so a polar vortex hits me in Colorado every year now, sometimes multiple times. The key is how cold it's going to get. So when I chose my apple trees, I chose apple trees that are hardy to zone 4. Now, I live in zone 5 and 5B specifically. So that means on average, my lowest winter temperature is minus 15 Fahrenheit. That's about minus 26 Celsius. The trees that I put into my landscape, into my garden, are good to zone 4, which actually means those trees can go down to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 34 Celsius. So I do nothing for my fruit trees because I know my fruit trees can handle that extreme cold. And I haven't seen that extreme cold. As cold as it's been, it hasn't been that cold. And so the polar vortex that will swing through the Midwest and hit my part of Colorado will drop temperatures well below zero, but not so low that it's in that critical range for the plants because I chose the right kind of plants. So that's what you've got to ask yourself first is, do you even need to protect the plants? If you've got apple trees that are hardy, you probably don't need to worry about it at all. If you've got other plants, fruit trees or fruit bushes that are not as hardy, that's when you need to do something to protect them. And so one of the classic things that gardeners have been doing for decades is to take burlap and straw, and you basically wrap your plant in straw, or you put the straw in the branches and around the tree, and then you wrap the whole thing with the burlap to hold the straw in place. And that creates insulation so that even when the outside air temperature gets to those extremes, it's not going to impact the plant because the plant is protected. If you live in a snowy region, snow is a great insulator. It can get down extremely cold. But if you've got snow around your plants, the temperature around your plants is freezing. It won't be that extreme low because the temperature of the snow is going to be pretty consistent at freezing, and your plants are going to be able to handle that. So look beyond just the temperature to think about what plants you're growing and what the plants are hardy to. And I almost never do anything for the plants. The only plants that I will protect in the winter are plants like rosemary, because rosemary is generally grown down to zone 6, and I live in zone 5. So if I grow rosemary outside, I have to protect it. I have to cover it. I have to add that extra insulation if I want it to survive my winters. And so those are really the questions you've got to ask. Is how cold the polar vortex is going to be. It may be extended for a month or 6 weeks, but it's not going to be that critical cold during that entire time. So you may only need to put protection out for a night or two. And it can be as simple as just wrapping a tree with plastic, wrapping a bush with burlap, whatever it is that you have. But the idea is to try to hold in some of the warmer air around the plant so that the buds, the branches, the trunks aren't exposed to that frigid cold air. You just have to keep that coldest air away from your plants and you should be fine. So Bowtie Light, can you define what exactly qualifies as a chill hour? So I talked about this recently, like I think 45 minutes ago, maybe 30 minutes ago. So you may have missed that part of the discussion. I know this is an older chat, so you may have asked this question before I talked about it, but I talked about it earlier, and so you might want to rewind and see if it's something that I didn't say. What temp? I talked about that. Pomegranates, I talked about that. And the number of chill hours. I talked about that. So you probably asked that question before I answered it. So if you didn't hear that answer, then just go ahead and rewind it about half an hour. And that's one of those things that has been discussed. I realize that I'm behind in my comments, so I'm going to scroll down and try to catch up so that the questions will actually correspond with the answers that may or may not have already been given. So yeah, Tony raises a good point too. Spraying with water can insulate trees. And so when I talk about the snow being an insulator, water could be an insulator too. Frozen water can be an insulator. So we see that here in California and Florida in particular, where the orchards will have tall poles that extend up above the trees, and then there'll be a spray nozzle at the top of the tree. And so for those trees that can't handle the frigid temperatures, they'll spray. So particularly in Florida, you'll see this often reported on national news here in the States. When the temperature is dropping to freezing, they spray their trees. When we look at the thermodynamics of water, it takes a lot of energy for water to change from a liquid to a solid, to turn to ice. And so that amount of energy can actually warm the temperature on a leaf. So water sprayed on a leaf when the temperature drops to freezing, that water generally is not going to freeze. The leaf is going to be protected. So it's crazy, the physics of water and the physics of thermodynamics. And so yeah, if the temperature is dropping near freezing, water can be enough to insulate the trees. And if you look at the farms or live near an orchard, you may see that in practice during the winter. It's really pretty cool. When it drops well below freezing, then yes, the water's going to freeze on the leaf, the water's going to freeze on the branch, and now it becomes an insulator. Ice is an insulator because it's only as cold as ice, and it will protect the plants from those really frigid air temperatures. So water can be one of those things that really makes a difference if you're trying to save some of your tender plants. Terry Hall's saying, I'm growing garlic in zone 9. That can be a challenge. Good for you. They're covered with wood shavings. Should I cut off the scapes that are popping up or cover some more? So I would cut off the scapes. Scapes, I've got a video, one of my early videos from many years ago on how to make garlic scape pesto. Delicious. And so cut off the scapes and use them in your kitchen. They're delicious. You can leave them in place, but they're sucking out energy from your plant. So all the energy that's going into growing that scape can go to making your bulb bigger. So by cutting the scape, you're going to increase the likelihood of getting a bigger bulb. They look cool. And these big scapes in the garlic beds are awesome, but use them, cut them, and let that energy go to the bulbs. And I think that's really the best way to deal with scapes. There's a few other videos out there. And I know when I first did my video on scapes, there weren't a lot of videos on scapes. I had a ton of people commenting that they'd never even heard of scapes. Well, now scapes are kind of a thing if you grow garlic. And it's the hardneck varieties that will produce the scape. So if you're seeing scapes, add them to your harvest. Locally, most of the time our farmers markets are starting later than the scapes appear, but there's a shallow window of opportunity. And so locally, some of our farmers markets are starting to sell scapes at the very beginning of our market season, because the garlic is at about the point that is sending up those scapes. All depends on where you live and whether you have a farmer's market, but scapes are becoming much more well known, and you'll see many more recipes out there for how to use scapes, including mine on how to make the pesto, which really is delicious. Sherry is saying my big dog has started burying his face in the planter on my front steps. Guess what's in there? Garlic. Nice. So I did have a problem with Lika digging in my garlic bed. I think because she was just curious. But I have never had that problem with Mala in my garlic bed. But that's funny. That's one of those things that added to your list. Take a picture and add it to your scrapbook. Yeah, Tony says scape pesto is stunning. I love that adjective. Thanks, Tony. The thing that I like to do with scapes. So the earlier you harvest the scapes, the more tender they can be. And so chopping them up finely and using them like you would use garlic is an option too. So I'll saute something and use the garlic scapes as extra flavoring and extra color as well, because it's always a nice, bright, vibrant green when you cook it. And so if you're doing a steak that you might normally put a garlic sauce on, you do a garlic pesto or garlic scape sauce that you could put on your steak or your fish or your vegetables even. So yeah, it can definitely be stunning. And so Rachel is asking, should I cut down the soft neck? So soft necks, no. So if you've got the leaves of the garlic that are growing, and so the key difference is that both soft neck and hard neck garlic varieties are going to send up the leaves. You want to leave those leaves because they're collecting the sun's energy, they're providing photosynthesis. That's what's making the bulb grow and making the whole plant grow. So no, you don't cut down the soft neck. And like for those of you that might be in zone 8 or zone 9 that are growing garlic and your winters don't get crazy cold and you're going to have leaves growing probably in December, January, and February, then leave those leaves because that's promoting growth of the roots and the bulb and more leaves. All of those leaves correspond to layers in your garlic bulb. So all the paper that protects the garlic bulb, those correspond with the leaves. So you really want those leaves in place to help protect that bulb while it's growing in the ground, but also after you harvest it for that paper to dry and allow you to store your garlic. So no, don't cut the leaves of the soft neck. We're just talking about the scape, that central stalk that will grow up in the middle of a hard neck variety. That's the piece that you want to cut back and to harvest. Eli and Kate says, I love mine done as tempura. Ooh, I don't think I've ever had garlic scape tempura, but I love the idea. I think I may have to try that this year. Oh, yeah, nice breading on the garlic scape. Oh, thank you, love. I think that is an awesome idea. Llama Llama says, I have to cover the garlic beds to protect them from the chickens. I had that problem a couple years ago when my neighbor's chickens escaped their area and hopped the fence over to my area. And the only thing growing at the time was garlic, and they did a number on my garlic bed. So yeah, that's definitely an issue. Okay, let's see. Serena says, bow tie life in the garden and I both have a birthday, December 29th. Well, happy birthday to you both. That's awesome. Hope you have a fantastic birthday week as you're coming. That reminds me, because we're fast approaching that last week of December, but I mentioned it last week, so I'll mention it again, and hopefully I'll remember to mention it again before the show is over. But this is the last show of 2024. I will not have a show next week during Christmas week, and I will not have a show the week after that during the New Year's week. So January 6th of 2025 will be the next Gardner Scott live stream. So mark your calendars accordingly, and we can all have a nice holiday season and take some time off on our Mondays. I know I will miss you, but I'll be back in 3 weeks on January 6th. I'll be doing some traveling during that time as well at the end of January. So you might hear more about that next year with that first show. And I look forward to seeing all of you back. over the next couple weeks, as you're visiting with family and friends and chatting about gardening and your plans, tell them about Garner Scott's community on Mondays. It would be lovely to see some new people popping up at the new year and expanding our community even more as we move into 2025. So share the word. Let's get people out and enjoying what we have happening with us. So let's go ahead and talk briefly about the background today. You may recognize this garden. Celeste has this garden, and I've shown it in different seasons because Celeste shares pictures of her garden in different seasons. And I think the winter garden can be beautiful, especially if you live in a region with a lot of snow. And so this is like a Christmas card with the trees covered with snow and the snow on the ground in the garden. So thank you, of course, Celeste, for sharing this with all of us. It's one of those things that if you can create your garden for multiple seasons, it just makes it easier to enjoy your garden during multiple seasons. And if it looks great in the winter, even though all of the plants might be brown and dry and dead, you can still get out there and just look at the beauty of a garden with nothing growing. I do that all the time. And especially with the snow, absolutely get out there and enjoy it. I do note that the chairs still have snow on them, so I will brush off the snow of my chairs and occasionally sit down, but I do a lot of standing in my winter garden and looking around. And one of the nice things about getting out in your garden in winter, and you can see this in Celeste's garden, is you can see the bones of the garden. You can see everything that's stark and naked, like your trellises and your beds and your pathways. When everything's growing and you've got green all around and the trees are tall and wide, you might lose sight of the structure of your garden. And so getting out in your garden in the winter when it's quiet and there is no other happenings in the garden, you don't have those pests, you don't have the plants that you have to tend to. You can just stand and observe and think about what the beds are going to be for next year. Think about trellises. Do you need more trellises? Do you need more beds like we were talking about earlier? What's going in the different beds? Do you need to move the trellises to put the beds or to put the plants someplace else? That's part of the review of our garden year as well. If you have plants that did well in one location, then start thinking about what other plants can do well in that location. And I'm moving around my plants all the time, not because of plant rotation due to pest or disease or soil nutrition. I move my plants around to try to find the best location for my plants based on sun and shade and the soil that is in that particular bed. And winter is a great time to start doing some of that analysis when you compare how well the plants do. So my melons, for instance, did pretty well this year, but I grew them in kind of my last bed that I planned. And because I wasn't sure if I was going to grow melons and what melons I was going to grow. So all the other beds had already been figured out. I put the melons in my bed number 4. I have my beds numbered for planning purposes. And they did fine. It took a long time for them to ripen, to the point that if we didn't have an unusually warm fall, I wouldn't have had melons. I was able to harvest melons. And as I thought about it, I realized that bed number 4 is the first bed every day in summer to get shade. That bed has less sun than any other bed in my garden. And that's the bed I was growing melons in, a plant that notoriously needs more sun. So this upcoming year, that's one of those lessons I've learned. I shouldn't be growing melons in bed number 4. I should be growing the melons in bed number 3 or in bed number 6, the ones that actually are the last to get shade when the sun starts going down. So stand in your garden in winter, even with snow on the ground, and start looking at those kind of things. I've noticed this year more so than in years past, just how much shade is being cast by my shed, by my gazebo. I now am putting up a fence that's going to cast more shade. So looking into next year, in my 2025 garden, I'm going to be really focusing on the shade and its impact on the garden. And you can kind of get a clue during winter about the sun. I did a video, and I'm sure Jay is already starting to look for it, on mapping, sun mapping your garden, looking at the difference between shade and sun. And do that over the course of an entire year, so that when you decide where you're going to put your plants and where you're going to put your beds, you can really choose the best location for whichever you need more of, the sun or the shade. I don't have shade loving plants because I don't have shade in my garden. Now that I'm building this new area with fences, I will finally have some shade during the growing season. I'm going to really take a close look on how much shade is produced so that I can start growing plants like hostas. I love hostas. Hostas can only grow in Colorado when they're in full shade. I'm looking forward to that because I'm building a garden area for that based on all my observations over all the years that I've been in this garden, and realize that to grow some plants, I need to create a new environment, a new microclimate based on the structures that I make. And you can do that by getting out in the garden in winter and starting some of that development and some of those thoughts in your garden. So you can continue looking at the picture behind us, and hopefully it does jog a memory of the garden, because we've shown this garden in spring and summer and fall, I believe, and winter as well. So I love seeing the different times. Brent sent me a picture that I'll be showing at the new year, and I am looking forward to whatever pictures the rest of you will be sharing with me going into the new year as well. It's okay to send a winter picture of your garden. I love winter pictures. So if you got a picture that you want to share, send it to Gardener Scott at gardenerscott.com. Give me permission to use it. Do it in landscape. That's the best way to send it. And I'll plan to add it to the queue. Tell me a little bit about it as well. I'd love to hear about your garden. So thank you for that. And yeah, the amount of snow that different regions have already gotten is pretty amazing when you look throughout the United States. There's that link. Thank you, Jay. How to find the best spot for plants. Sun map your garden. And so I talk about in that video in winter, getting out there and starting to look at the sun, and then how you can map it over the course of the year. And particularly with the winter solstice coming up, that's a great time to start. The shade is the longest, the sun is the shortest. In the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. The sun is the longest, the shade is the shortest. So use that solstice as a time to start mapping your garden with the sun and the shade. If you haven't done it before, do it this year, and you might be surprised at what you see when you're actually making a point to look. Betty says, I need to do some mapping too. New garden with the new home. There you go. Yeah, especially in a new garden. I often recommend taking a year before you put the garden in because of the mapping, because of pest patterns, weather patterns, sun patterns, to really have the best success. It's so difficult moving into a new house. Gardeners are patient, but it's hard to be patient when you want to start the garden. But mapping and seeing what is happening outside can make a big difference. I've had to move beds at houses in the past because I didn't take the time, because I wanted to get out and garden. And I look up and say, oh, this spot should be good. And you put a bed in and you start growing. And then you discover later, sometimes years later, that just doesn't work. And you might have to move it or change the purpose of that bed if it's really not producing the way that that you would hope that it would be. Big Will Dog says, ironically, we'll be the closest to the sun during the northern winter and furthest during the summer. Yeah, that's crazy about the orbit of the sun. That the distance from the sun doesn't make sense for the heat that the sun actually seems to give us. Instead, it's the way our planet is pointing at that particular time of year. So when we talk celestial bodies, that's pretty crazy. So yes, that is quite ironic, but it reverses. And when we start pointing towards the sun, it's nice, and we can enjoy the sun and all that it gives us during that wonderful time of year. Jan's got a great suggestion, and I strongly agree with this. Grow bags are a good way to start before you know the sun pattern. Absolutely. And so I talked about this 5 years ago in a couple of videos as I was starting my garden. And that's what I did. I started growing in containers. And so I have a video from 5.5 years ago now where I show growing in 5-gallon buckets. I was at my daughter's house at the time starting those 5-gallon buckets, but I carried those buckets to my new house and I put them in different spots of the garden during that first summer as part of my observation. The buckets allowed me to grow, and it gave me some of that perspective of where I should put my garden. And grow bags will do the exact same thing. So awesome suggestion. Absolutely. You can still garden in a container in a new location while you're developing some of that information that will be important for the future years. Because if you can get it right in the beginning, there's less work later on. If you're going to build a bed and then walk away from it and just grow plants in it and be happy with it, as opposed to building a bed and realizing I made a mistake and I've got to do something. I got to take the bed apart, move the bed, build a new bed, whatever it happens to be. But starting right in the beginning is really the best approach if you can do it. So there's one of my container videos. Thank you, Jay. Grow a fall container vegetable garden. I actually have a playlist of different container videos. I've actually, I don't think I've added to it in recent months, but yeah, I've got a number of videos on container gardening, and they cover a lot of different subjects. So that's always good. And Shandy's Garden says, move the containers around and take pictures. Absolutely. I tend to do more video than pictures these days, but you're exactly right. Documenting what's happening and keeping track of it, pictures, video, whatever your preference is, absolutely. But saying, don't forget that partial shade is a useful thing to have in the garden too. Yes, you're exactly right. And so the planning for the plants that you're going to put into the beds do take into account the shade. And so in my pollinator garden with my flowers, I've done that, and you can do that as well. If you get seeds or you get the plants to put in your garden, make note of their light requirements. And often with the flowering plants, especially if you read through the catalogs like we were talking a couple weeks ago, they'll say prefers afternoon shade, or the opposite, prefers afternoon sun. All the plants are different. But yes, bud, you can definitely build that into your plan, because if you've got an area that is shaded, and I've got an area by my garage in my pollinator garden that gets early shade, and those are the plants that I put in that are those plants that benefit from protection during the afternoon. And that's all part of that mapping, all part of that planning, so that you can use it to your advantage. So definitely do that, and it will definitely make a difference. I can promise you on that. There you go, Jay. Thanks. The container gardening playlist with multiple videos. That's a good link for that. And it covers the 5-gallon buckets like I was just talking about, but a lot on the grow bags as well. So I think my potato growing in grow bags is in that list. And so like Tony, I like to grow my potatoes in containers, and grow bags is usually what I use. And so I show that in one of those videos. And it can be advantageous, because the nice thing about the grow bags and other containers is if you make that mistake of putting it in the wrong location to start, you just move it to a better location in the same season. Don't think that you're locked into your grow bag location for the year. Even with the bigger grow bags, you might need help lifting them once they're filled with soil and plants, but you can move them around throughout the growing season. That's really an advantage to using the bags like that. Bud says, you will probably cover this in a future session, but I'm starting to map out my beds for 2025 in the Planter app. Yeah, I am planning to cover that in the future, of course, and revisit some of what I covered this year with the Planter app. They've added a bunch of stuff to the Planter app. So I hope to have Peter on the show again next year, and we'll talk about some of the new designs that are in the Planter app that make it easier to use than it was already easy to use. And I've got a link in the description below to the Planter app. Great app for planning the garden. So thanks for mentioning that, Bud, because it works, and it makes planning easier. And I had to use it again this year. One of the things that I've talked about in the past, I mark all of my plants and with plant tags, but sometimes those plant tags get knocked down, they get moved, they get blown away. This year, some of those plant tags got broken off by a puppy jumping in the bed. And so luckily I had all of the plants on my Planter app for that bed. And it was the bed, of course, that I had multiple plants growing. So I had carrots, I had beets, I had radishes, I had lettuce, I had spinach, all growing in the same bed. And then all the plant tags got knocked off by little puppy paws. The Planter app was great for being able to remember which plants were which. Not which plant. I know what a carrot plant looks like, but I was growing a couple different varieties of carrots. I was growing a couple different varieties of beets and a couple different varieties of spinach. And so that was really helpful to be able to pull out the app and know that the orange carrots were over here and the yellow carrots were in this other spot, without having to actually dig up the carrots and see what color they were. So beneficial to use an app, absolutely. Margaret Alice is saying, I grow oregano, mint, all sorts of times, and afternoon sun only. I find limiting their sun makes the herbs much tastier, even though all the books say grow in full sun. Oh yeah, I do that as well. I've got my thyme in particular growing in a couple different locations, and the thyme that gets some of that shading does better. Bigger plants, and the leaves are bigger, which, I mean, it's relative. Thyme has a small leaf, but the leaves are bigger on those plants that get a little bit of shading. And the same holds true with many other herbs that you're growing in your garden. So yeah, totally agree with you. You know, the books are a baseline filled with generalities, and generally most plants benefit from more sun. And the common mistake that new gardeners make is they'll put a garden in an area that fits with their yard without taking into account how much sun it gets. And so many new gardens don't have enough sun. So all the books say full sun for everything. But those of us that have gardened for a while recognize that's not always the case. Some shade at some times can be beneficial. And I would agree with you. My oregano, I showed it actually in the video I did earlier a few months ago, where I talked about what went wrong in the garden. What went wrong in the garden this year, one of the things that I now have to review and modify, is that my oregano did too well. It grew so tall, so wide. It was so happy that it really started interfering with other plants in that bed, particularly my espalier apple tree. And so, why? Because it gets that afternoon sun. The oregano that I had growing in other areas doesn't get nearly that big, doesn't grow nearly as well. It's all that premium shade at the most important time of day. And so I'm going to be moving that oregano to another spot that actually doesn't get as much shade. And the reason is because I don't want my oregano growing that big. I didn't know that particular variety of oregano would grow that big when it got into a spot that it was so happy with. So keep that in mind. When you give your plants their happy spot, they're going to end up growing bigger. They'll taste better probably along the way, but it is one of those things that you need to take into account. Tony says painted pebbles are a good way to mark up what's in the bed and they don't get moved. Good thinking, Tony. I haven't done that. I've painted my pebbles and my small stones like strawberries to put in my strawberry beds to deter the birds. And I've had my granddaughters paint small stones as plant tags, but that was more of just a way to get my granddaughters involved with the garden. The idea of just using colored pebbles, that's easy. And you could do that with multiple colors, with multiple beds, with multiple plants. I love that idea. So thank you for sharing that. Well, I bet you there'll be a lot more of us with painted pebbles in our garden in this upcoming year. Sunset Gazing, thank you so much for that. Gifted 5 memberships. And so I will mention the idea of memberships. The gift is a great thing to do, especially during this time of giving. So thank you so much for that. There are 3 different levels of membership to help support the Gardener Scott channel. And the training level and the collaborator level are the levels that get a little bit more perks than the basic support level. Today, right after this live stream, give me 10 minutes, but we'll be getting back on for a members only live stream. So that's one of the advantages of the members for the channel, for the Gardener Scott membership, is extras like an extra live stream. So if you like hanging out and asking questions, the nice thing about it, and you've already seen this in the comments, I can't get to all the comments and I miss a lot, and I apologize for that with all the people that are on today. But the members only live streams are much smaller groups and everything gets answered. So that's one of the advantages of becoming a member of the Gardener Scott channel, is those live streams where you literally can ask anything and every question gets answered. We stay on until all the questions are done. And then we talk about other things, of course, as well. I'll share usually a little bit more advanced information. So these live streams tend to be mostly basic information, but in the members only live streams, I'll throw out a lot more higher level experienced kind of information. So if you like that kind of stuff, become a member of the channel and you can participate along with the members only Facebook group, which also has a ton of great information being passed back and forth. So this is just such a great community, and that's what helps make it a community. Are members like those of you that are members and those of you that gift members to others. So fantastic for that. Thank you so much. And so as we get to the end of this year and we look back on the growing season we had, I encourage you to go all the way back to the beginning of the year. And like I said at the very beginning, even to previous years. And it's easy to focus on the garden, to look at your beds, your plants, your failures, your successes. But one of the things I really like doing at the end of the year. I do it all year round, but I really try to make a point to do it at the end of the year. And I touched on it previously, was what impact did you have on the people that are in your life because of your garden, because of your gardening, because of what your garden gives you and gives to others. And it could be the stuff that you gave away when you were trying to get rid of your zucchini. It could be the knowledge that you shared with someone who was just trying to figure out how to put seeds in the ground. There's so many examples that can be given, but I encourage you to try to think about some of those things, to recognize that you, as a gardener, really do make a difference in the world. Even if it's just a single person that you talked to about gardening, you really can't tell what that impact was. And you may never know, but occasionally, and I love when this happens, occasionally that person will come back to you and say, hey, I started a garden after our conversation, or I started growing that tomato you recommended. It goes on, and it can be the gift that keeps on giving. You give your time, you give your expertise, you give your joy of gardening to somebody else, and generations from now, that can be carried forward just because of your simple act, your kindness, your decision to share what means something to you. So I encourage this time of year that we tend to set aside for giving and for sharing. Make it about you. Make it about your garden. Make it about your experiences. And let somebody else hear about that. If you've got extra seeds to give your seeds as gifts during this season. If you've got extra jars of jams or jelly, that's my favorite to give, or those pickled peppers, or whatever it happens to be, yeah, give one of those away to someone in need who would really appreciate your efforts. Just think about the giving and the sharing, and the sky is the limit. And it doesn't need to be only at the end of the year. If you do it at the end of the year, it becomes so easy to do at the beginning of the year. So next year in our gardens, as we're planning right now, add that to your plan. Think about what you can do over the course of the year to help out some of those others, to do some of those things. I know some of you have become master gardeners as a result of hearing that I was a master gardener. And now you are doing some of what I've done over the years by sharing what you learned in the Master Gardener program from here on out. If you're not a master gardener and it interests you, check it out. See what needs to be done in your area to become a master gardener and share with your community. That's the thing about the Master Gardener program. It's all about volunteering. It's all about giving time and knowledge to those that need it. And as you well know, all of us who are gardeners have needed a lot of advice and knowledge and help along the way. You might be able to be one of those people that shares those kind of things and helps somebody out in the future. So you never know. It's nice to have the wrapped gifts. It's nice to get some of those tools, some of those things we talked about in the show a couple weeks ago. That's nice. But the gift of your time may be the most important gift you can give. And too often it's the gift we give least. So I'm planning to do that this next weekend. Going to go up to my stepdaughter's house, new house, and we'll be talking about plants and planning the new garden for next year. And her partner is all about gardening and trying new things and growing food for their family. And I'm going to help out. Of course, I want to see them and I want to see my granddaughter. That's always another benefit. And I'm going to benefit throughout the experience of talking and sharing and creating those memories. And when I leave, I look forward to finding out more from them next year. And it all can be traced back to just that simple act of giving, of talking, of sharing, of just being a gardener, because that's what gardeners do. I hope you've had a fantastic year. There's always good things about gardening. You may have to search a little bit to find it, but it sets us up for next year, because as you know, next year's always going to be better in the garden. It's always better. At the end of the year, it may not seem that way, but then there's the next year that will always be better. So I hope next year is your best garden yet. And I know it's going to be my best garden yet. I'll be here with all of you next year, January 6th, to get it started so that all of our gardens really can reach that level of success that we're looking for. Have a wonderful holiday season. Have a fantastic new year, and just appreciate that you're a gardener, and that really means something. I'll see you next year. Above all, enjoy gardening.